I'd like you to join me on a quick tour through the Holy Land. You can follow in our footsteps as we followed the footsteps of Jesus in March 1999 as part of a pilgrimage from the Immaculate Heart of Mary Church. First, realize that Israel is a small country. It's about 1/6 the size of Pennsylvania. That's good for us because we were able to see a lot in a short period of time. We arrived at the airport near Tel Aviv. It was about 9:30 at night, and we were about 4 hours late. Our tour buses took us to the town of Netanya, which is about an hour north of the airport. Of course, by the time we got to the hotel in Netanya, it was after midnight, and then we had dinner. Never mind. The next morning we opened our hotel windows to a spectacular view of the Mediterranean Sea, looking back towards the town of Netanya. The first day we went north to the town of Caesarea. This is an old Roman city begun about 100 years before Christ, and Herod was the great builder of the city. They have now unearthed and reconstructed a great Colosseum and an aqueduct, which transported water over 7 miles into the city. These things you see and can touch are literally over 2,000 years old. The town of Caesarea is also important because in our Easter liturgy this year, we hear of Peter visiting here, and this is where they had the first conversions of the Gentiles. Our next stop was at the town of Megiddo. This is an old fortress city that was abandoned in 200 BC. Through the excavations, they have found it was destroyed and rebuilt 25 times, going back to 4000 BC. One of the most interesting parts of this occurred in about 900 BC. King Ahab built a water system to supply this fortress and make it immune to attacks and sieges. He did this by digging a great shaft down through the ground and then a 300-foot-long tunnel through sheer rock over to the spring at the base of the fortress. This way he was assured of a water supply, no matter what happened around him. The town of Megiddo may not mean much to us, but it is the basis of the word Armageddon. This is the site of many decisive Old Testament battles. The book of Revelation has this as the place of the last great battle before the second coming. Our next stop was at Mount Carmel. This is an area the Holy Family knew because they stopped here in a cave on their return to Nazareth after the flight into Egypt. At the present time, it is a Carmelite monastery. There is also a cave of Elijah on the mountain. The next stop, and the main focus of the day, was Nazareth. We went to the Church of the Annunciation, which is built over the remains of a cave, which was part of Mary's house. This is where the angel of the Lord made the announcement to Mary, and Mary accepted the will of God. The upper church is where we had our Mass that afternoon, and we had Masses every day while we were touring. Adjacent, and across a courtyard, is the Church of St. Joseph. This is a church built over the remains of Joseph's workshop. The gate to the remains was closed, but this is where it was. We were not able to stop at the third major site in Nazareth, which is Mary's well. This was under reconstruction at the time. This is a well that has been in use since Mary's time, and she certainly drew water there. Why are there so many churches? The answer is that there are so many religious sites to be preserved. Various denominations from the 4th century, the times of the Crusaders, and to the present, have built churches or basilicas over the remains to protect them. Most of these contain spectacular artwork. They're just incredible. We drove through a suburb of Nazareth called Cana. We were not able to stop there, but of course this is the site of the first miracle of Jesus. We continued on to our hotel for the next 2 nights at Tiberias, on the Sea of Galilee. Several of us decided to get up at 5 a.m. the next morning to see the sunrise over the Sea of Galilee. We did that, and when we went down to the dockside, what caught our eye most were the fishermen using hand nets, just like in Jesus' time. The only discrepancy in the picture is the presence of outboard motors and a gasoline can. The Sea of Galilee is approximately 13 miles long and 7 miles wide. Today we would call it a lake. It is fresh water, is quite deep, and has a great abundance of fish. From the dockside, you can see all the way up into Syria. Mount Hebron is in the distance, and in March it had snow on the top. This day we went to the town of Caesarea Philippi. This is the northernmost part of Israel, and it is notable for several reasons. First, this is the source of the Jordan River, where it flows out of the mountain and heads down through all of Israel to the Dead Sea. Second, is that this site has been in use since way before the Romans. The Greeks had it first as a cave of Pan, then the Romans. It was in use during Jesus' time, and he and the disciples were here. This is where Peter professed his faith. As you remember, Jesus asked, "Who do the people say the Son of Man is?" Peter answered, "You are the Messiah." Then Jesus said, "And you are Peter, and upon this rock I shall build my church." Another contemporary point to note is that at Caesarea Philippi, you are approximately 2 miles from the borders of Syria and Lebanon, very unfriendly neighbors of Israel. On the way back to Capernaum and the Sea of Galilee, we traveled via the Golan Heights. This is an area that used to be part of Syria until the Six-Day War in 1967, when Israel recaptured it. Along both sides of the road are signs warning of unexploded mines. This area was mined heavily when Syria occupied it. At present, this land is being used for grazing. The next place we went to was on the northeast of the Sea of Galilee, a town called Bethsaida. This means house of fishes, and was a major fishing village during the time of Jesus. This is the land of James and John, the sons of Zebedee. This is where the Jordan River empties into the Sea of Galilee, and is where Jesus made his initial call to the disciples to become fishers of men. From there we traveled west along the top of the Sea of Galilee to the area called Capernaum. This area was the center of Jesus' ministry. The first site we visited was the remains of Peter's house, where Jesus stayed while preaching at the local synagogue. Here, instead of building a church all around it, a church is built suspended over the remains. Adjacent to that are the remains of a 4th century synagogue, and the 4th century synagogue was probably built over the remains of an even earlier synagogue. In the Bible, we hear of Jesus going into the synagogue and teaching with authority, and this probably happened here. At most of these sites, Father Langen read the appropriate Bible passages, which really helped us make the connection with what we were seeing. The next place we visited is called the Primacy of Peter Church. This is where Jesus appeared to the disciples after the resurrection. You remember the story when they went out fishing at night, caught nothing, and then he told them to cast their nets in a different area, and they came up overflowing with fish. When they came ashore, there was a rock with fire and fish being cooked on it. This is where it happened, and the rock is preserved in the church. This is also the place where Jesus had the dialogue with Peter, starting with, "Do you love me?" and ending with, "Peter, feed my sheep." Our next stop was on the south side of the Sea of Galilee, called Yardenit. This is the traditional site for baptisms, and they have built ramps going down into the water for full immersion baptisms. You can also see in this picture how small, narrow, and meek the River Jordan is here. Our guide explained that they've had a very dry winter, and there is much water being drawn for irrigation these days. Our next stop was at the Mount of the Beatitudes. I'm including a picture here from a flyer because you can see the Church of the Beatitudes at the top of the hill. And this is where Jesus delivered the Sermon on the Mount. We had our Mass at that church and then continued on around the Sea of Galilee to the site of the feeding of the multitudes from the 5 fishes and loaves. Then, a short ride away, was the dockside, where we got onto a boat to take us out into the Sea of Galilee on our way back to Tiberias. Partway back, Father Langen had the boat stopped, the engine was shut off, and it was dead calm. He then read the passage about Jesus' appearance on the sea and Peter's little faith. It was a moment none of us will ever forget. From there we proceeded back to Tiberias and our hotel rooms. The next morning was Friday morning, and we were up early and back on the bus on our way to Mount Tabor and the Church of the Transfiguration. Mount Tabor rises sharply 1,800 feet from the plain. It's so steep up there that the tour buses can only go up part way, and then you transfer into these stretch taxis for the ride the rest of the way up. It's a one-lane road with many, many switchbacks, and the taxi drivers go as fast as they can. The church is built over the site of the Transfiguration. You can actually touch the stone. There's a trapdoor in the floor over the stone in the part of the church where we had our Mass. Then there was the ride back down the mountain, worse than the ride up. Our next stop was at the town of Beth Shean. This is an ancient crossroads. It's been there for millenniums because it was a crossroads of the old trade routes to Persia and such. They even found a statue of Ramses, proving the Egyptians were there. What's fascinating here is that again there was an ancient fortress with 24 layers of civilization being uncovered. The most ancient is from the 5th millennium BC. That's 7,000 years ago. Built over that is a Roman city, a very elaborate Roman city, which was destroyed by an earthquake in 749 AD. And then another civilization came along and built over those remains. And now they're uncovering them. They've been working on this project for about 10 years now, and they estimate that they have uncovered only about 5% of what's there. Most of the city is still underground. Compare the scale of the columns next to the people walking there. It was like being transported back into that Roman city. Jesus preached to Gentiles here. The name of this town in his day was Scythopolis. The next town we visited was Jericho. As you can see on a map, going from Bethshean to Jericho, you go straight south down the Jordan Valley. This is also near the Israeli border with the country of Jordan. As a result, there were many fences, military vehicles, and such. Jericho is the oldest and lowest city on earth. It started about 8,000 BC and is 600 feet below sea level. Again, there is a fortress area which is being excavated. They found this tower, which they estimate dates back to 2200 BC, and this may be part of the walls of Jericho which came tumbling down after 7 days. The next place we went in Jericho is the tree of Zacchaeus. This is where the short man Zacchaeus waited for Jesus in a sycamore tree. Jesus called him down. Zacchaeus repented and was granted salvation. This sycamore is over 2,000 years old and is recognized as the tree Zacchaeus was in when Jesus walked by. From Jericho, we traveled to Jerusalem that afternoon. We traveled along the New Road. We'll talk more about this later. The distance between Jericho and Jerusalem is only about 15 miles. Jericho is 600 feet below sea level. Jerusalem is about 3,000 feet above sea level, and partway along the road there's a sign that you are now at sea level. The fascinating part was that this is the Judean wilderness, or desert. We did see tribes of Bedouin with their herds living in this wilderness. Our next stop was on the Mount of Olives. The Mount of Olives is a fairly large area next to Jerusalem and has several towns in it, such as Bethany. We went to the Church of the Ascension, and this site has been noted since the 4th century A.D. This is the place where Jesus ascended into heaven at the end of his earthly ministry. The stone is preserved as the site, and you can touch it. Nearby on the Mount of Olives is the Church of Pater Noster. This is built over a cave where Jesus gave the Lord's Prayer to his disciples. It was in a cave because they were hiding out at the time from the authorities. Around the courtyard of the church, the Lord's Prayer is recorded on tablets in well over 100 languages. This is now a monastery. From there, we went to our hotel in Jerusalem. Honestly, all 3 hotels in Israel were new, modern hotels, and the food was excellent. The next morning we went to a place in Jerusalem where they have a scale model of the old city as it was in Jesus' time. It's 1/50th of actual size, so you walk around it. The things to note in this picture. The big rectangular area is the old temple area of Jerusalem. In the center of that, in the boxy building, is where the Ark of the Covenant was kept. The temple was where Jesus was presented as an infant, and was where Jesus drove out the merchants on 2 different occasions. To the left of the temple area is the Antonia, or guardhouse. This is where Jesus was scourged before his crucifixion. The third place to note is near the lower left of the picture. Outside of the old city walls is the hill of Golgotha, where the crucifixion took place. So you see, as we will do later this day, the way of the cross went from the Antonia across town, downward in this picture, and outside the city wall to the hill of Golgotha. We will follow the same path later this day. The next stop that day was in Bethlehem. We stopped first for some shopping, and then we went to the courtyard and into St. Catherine's Church, and then adjacent to that, into the Basilica of the Nativity. This is a Byzantine church which dates from the 4th century A.D. This church was one of the few not destroyed by the Turks when they took over the country. The Crusaders restored it in the 11th century A.D. It's a beautiful Byzantine church, but quite different from any we have seen. Under that huge altar facade is the cave of the Nativity. You go down some steps into the cave, and at the bottom there is a silver star marking the place where Jesus was born. Yes, you can touch it. Across the room is the manger where Jesus was laid. Yes, you can touch it too. By the way, this is Saturday afternoon, and the following events were the high point of the trip for all of us. First, we went to Herod's Gate, where the bus dropped us off. We went into the old city of Jerusalem, and there are vendors everywhere. Our first stop was at the Church of the Flagellation, or the Scourging at the Pillar. We had our Mass there that afternoon. This is also the first Station of the Cross. As you may know, all of our Masses and morning and evening prayer services were prepared for us in advance by our liturgist, Karen Kreller. Each of these focused on the place where we were. What is worth noting is that at the end of this Mass at the Church of the Flagellation, we closed singing the song, Jesus, Remember Me. From there we went across the courtyard to the Church of the Condemnation, which is the second Station of the Cross. This is the area I pointed out earlier, where the Antonia was. The stones on the floor have ridges, put there to keep horses and people from slipping. These are authentic stones from the time of Christ. At this second station, we picked up our cross and proceeded along the Stations of the Cross and the Via Dolorosa. At each station, we switched so that a number of us were able to carry the cross. It's another experience we will never forget. The Way of the Cross winds through city streets clogged with merchants, just as it was in Jesus' time. The Way of the Cross also goes through a church or two. Along the way, the stations are marked, and there are other places, like where Jesus fell and his handprint is on the wall. Finally, we arrived at the 10th Station of the Cross. This is outside where the old city walls were, and is at the base of Golgotha. Now today there is this huge church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is built over the whole area of Golgotha. We proceeded inside and went upstairs to the 11th Station of the Cross, where Jesus was nailed to the cross. Next to that is the 12th Station of the Cross, where the crucifixion took place. Remember, we said we had to walk upstairs, because in fact, in the floor of this 12th station is the top of the rock of Golgotha. And you can reach down and touch the hole in the rock where the cross was. Our group started singing spontaneously, Jesus, Remember Me, as we had earlier that day. From there you go to the 13th station of the cross, where Jesus was laid after being taken down from the cross at the bottom of Golgotha. Then you proceed from there to the empty tomb, the 14th station. From there, we continued walking across the present Old City to the Jaffa Gate and our awaiting bus to take us back to the hotel. The next morning, this is Sunday now, we went first to the Mount of Olives in the area called Bethany. This is where Mary and Martha lived with their brother Lazarus. We celebrated Mass in the chapel of the Church of St. Lazarus. We then walked up the hill and then went down a long flight of stairs to the entrance of Lazarus' tomb. And you can go in there and touch it. We got back on the bus and went back to Jericho. But this time we went along the old route, the route that Jesus and all the people of the time took between these cities. You can begin to see how stark and bleak the desert is in the Judean wilderness. This is where Jesus lived and fasted for 40 days. The road the bus followed is a one-lane road. We were in a great big tour bus, and there are no guardrails. We stopped partway through to look down into the valley where St. George's Monastery is. The other interesting thing to see is on this next picture. You can see the road we followed in the upper part of the picture. Below that is a line, and this is an aqueduct. There is a spring in this wilderness, and this aqueduct carries water into Jericho today, as it has for over 2,000 years. The area around here is so rugged and bleak. This has been a refuge for outlaws. Walking through the valley had to be extremely difficult and dangerous, and this is considered to be the Valley of the Shadow of Death. You get the image the writer of the 23rd Psalm knew. Our next stop was south of Jericho, an area called Qumran. This overlooks the Dead Sea and is on the plains of Jericho, the area where John the Baptist ministered. This is the site of a monastery where the Dead Sea Scrolls were written. The Dead Sea Scrolls are copies of the Bible they had at the time, plus many monastery documents. The scrolls were stored in about 70 A.D., just before the Romans took over this whole area. The community stored the scrolls in a cave in the hillside, and then fled to Jerusalem. The scrolls were discovered in 1949 and have been used to update our Old Testament. Our next stop was at Masada. The Jewish word means stronghold. If you have seen the movie, you know the story. It's a very high plateau, completely cut off from the surrounding terrain. It overlooks the Dead Sea and is an ideal refuge. Over the years, the Romans built many things up there. Herod had a 3-story palace built down over one side from the top. When you get up there, you can see these many ruins. The most famous story is about the last Jewish tribe of patriots holding out against the Roman occupation. In 60 or 70 A.D., they took refuge in Masada. The Romans were so determined to get them that they committed over 10,000 men and took 6 to 9 months to lay siege to this fortress. They finally succeeded by building up a huge earthen ramp up the backside of Masada so they could get their siege machines and catapults to break down the walls. Today, you can still see the outlines of the Roman camps around Masada, the ramp up the backside, and the stones they used in the catapults when they stormed the place. Rather than being captured by the Romans, the 960 zealots met in the synagogue and chose to take their own lives rather than live in slavery to Rome. Some of our group walked down from the top of Masada. It takes about a half an hour on a very winding path. We headed north back to near Qumran for our dip in the Dead Sea, 1,300 feet below sea level. It is 10 times saltier than our seawater, and as a result, you float roughly like this. This picture is not very clear, but you can get the idea. It's tough getting in and out because of the black, slimy Dead Sea mud over a lot of rocks down there. But it was something we just had to do. The mud is supposed to have medicinal powers. Finally, we headed back to our hotel Sunday night. The next day, Monday, was sort of our day off. We went down into the old city in the morning to do some shopping and sightseeing. Again, you can see what the old city streets look like, even today. And then, just about all of us had our chance at camel riding. This camel was so well trained, he could drink Coke out of a bottle all by himself. Tuesday morning started our last day in the Holy Land. We started by going to the town of Aim Karem. It's southwest of Jerusalem, not too far from Bethlehem. This is the place where Mary's cousin Elizabeth lived. The church where we had our Mass was the Church of the Visitation. The point to note here is that Mary traveled from her home in Nazareth, in the northern part of Israel, down here south of Jerusalem, some 80 or 90 miles. She did this traveling on donkey, on a cart, on foot, or somehow, while she was pregnant with Jesus. And then she went home, back to Nazareth, and then came down again to Jerusalem with Joseph. The Church of the Visitation is another one of those beautiful places to celebrate Mass. Below the church is preserved a piece of a rock believed to have sheltered Mary and Jesus during Herod's slaughter of baby boys, known as the time of Holy Innocents. You also get a chance to see in this area how rugged the shepherds' fields were. Nothing at all like York County. They are very rocky, steep, and terraced. The only thing you can do with the hills is to graze sheep. Our next stop was at the Upper Room, the site of the Last Supper. The room was much larger than we expected. It's like a medium-sized banquet hall. We stopped at King David's tomb. Then we went to the Wailing Wall. Because it's Orthodox, there is a section for men and a section for women. We were able to enter the area as long as a hat or a cardboard yarmulke, which they supplied, covered our heads. From there we went to the old temple area, also known as Mount Moriah. At the center of this is a great golden dome, the Dome of the Rock. What is memorialized there for the Muslim faith is that this is where Muhammad ascended into heaven upon his horse. For us, this is the place where Abraham was going to slay his son Isaac, except that God intervened. The stone where this happened is here, purchased by King David. We were able to enter the mosque as long as we removed our shoes. Next we walked to the area where the pools of Bethesda were. This is the site of one of Jesus' miracles, the curing of the paralytic man. Leaving Jerusalem for the last time, we went over to the Mount of Olives. This next picture shows how the Mount of Olives looks as seen from Jerusalem. It's about 2 miles away, and there's a valley in between. This next picture shows what it looks like from the top of the Mount of Olives, looking back towards Jerusalem. You can see the Dome of the Rock in the center, and the city wall in front. This is what Jesus saw when he looked over Jerusalem. We started walking down from the top of the Mount of Olives. Partway down the mountain is a church called Dominus Flevit, which means where the Lord wept. This is where Jesus wept for Jerusalem. The window behind the altar in the church looks out over the city of Jerusalem. We continued down the Mount of Olives to the Garden of Gethsemane at the bottom. There's a very large church built there next to the garden. The garden is on the left. This garden has been there since Jesus' time. We learned that olive trees do not die. They sort of regenerate. As a result, some of these olive trees in the garden were there when Jesus was there. Inside the church is the stone of the agony in the garden. We got on the bus for the next to the last time and went to our farewell dinner on our way to the airport. Some other thoughts. Jericho, Bethlehem, the Mount of Olives, and half of Jerusalem are PLO territories, to be united as the West Bank in May 1999, when the accords are settled. We went through numerous checkpoints, and lots of automatic weapons were visible. Palestinian police are not allowed to bear arms, so Israeli police are everywhere. But we never felt unsafe on the entire trip. We gained great respect for the people of Israel. The country is just over 50 years old, and they are facing major political changes with the evolution of the West Bank Accords. In the old city of Jerusalem, Christians, Jews, and Muslims all live and work together. Everything that is green has to be irrigated, and the country is far more hilly or mountainous than we ever anticipated. It's a tough country, but they are a tough people and are working hard seeking peace. The tour company, our guide, Gadi Hadani, Father Langen, and Jean Fitzgibbons were responsible for making it possible to experience so much. In many cases, we were on a very tight schedule, but it all came off without a hitch. Many of the days we were able to pray morning prayer and or the rosary during our bus travel. And then Gadi would explain the background on the next place we were about to visit. Also thanks to Jean, Irene, and Dan for their pictures used in this. In summary, we didn't expect to be able to make direct contact, as we did with all these places. It was an instant leap across 2,000 years. The Bible and all of the events on which we base our faith have always been detached from our reality by distance and all those years. Suddenly, you are there and can make contact. Be in the same place, touch the same stone, see the same view as our Lord and the disciples did. Often, It was nearly overwhelming. As the car commercial says, this changes everything. When we hear the readings on a Sunday now, there's almost always a place with which we have contact. In many cases, we can visualize it. It has increased our faith by at least a quantum leap. Pilgrims are supposed to visit and then bring back the knowledge and wonders they have seen. Our goal through these pictures and narrative is to help you increase your faith in Jesus and what his life and empty tomb means to our lives and our salvation. Shalom.